So that's what you're studying. That's fantastic. So with that, let's transition to you, and let's explore this together, and think about the questions that you have. Try to make them brief, and I think that we would like to make it so that several of you comment and then come back to the. So can you guys remember things in your head from several people? No. But I want to get into a lot of voices. Is that okay? Because I think that's important as well. Are you going to handle it?
There's a process. No,
there's a process.
Yes.
So I'll respect the process.
We will have someone from this side share a question. If you need to give context to the question, make it very short. We only have a little over a half hour, and there are lots of people here. Then we'll have someone from the other side make a similar comment and raise a question. It doesn't have to be the same kind of question. And Julie will have a microphone, and I will have the other microphone here. So we have an initial question here.
Okay, it's a privilege, thank you, to be the first one. I'm not even a real American. I've only lived here for 12 years. Thank you, Diane, for putting this together. You're my hero. But I just want to say that, for full disclosure, I'll be traveling to Cleveland and Chicago to talk about how rock and roll brought down communism. And the reason I say this, maybe country music did have something to do with this. But I just want to say that I'm pretty good at figuring out when I hear a song for the first time, I kind of know it's a hit. I kind of know when I hear rock and roll music that it's really going to hit people's hearts and minds. What you guys are doing is exactly that. So rather than being, I work in the think tank world, sometimes very boring. I want to encourage you not to think too much about the theory of it. And I just want you to use rock and roll terms. Go on the road, take your music out there, because it's going to be huge. I do have a question. I'm Hungarian. We have a problem in Hungary. Last week there was an attack on the Jewish community. So spot on. You should be going to Hungary as Americans to deliver your message. So my question: have you been thinking about going abroad and taking your American message to Europe, where it's very badly needed?
We're going to have several or three?
It's up to you, whatever you think.
No,
Let's do two at a time.
Oh, sure.
Okay? Sure. Julie, you get to choose.
I love ice cream. Okay, I want to tell you that I read Rising from Hatred, and that's why I'm here. This is great work. Thank you. I wanted to ask, and I hope I'm not, telling tales out of school, but I seem to remember that there was some discussion of a loving relationship. And I am thinking that since in our Christian tradition we are told to love one another, and that in my experience I'm not as open to people with whom I do not have a loving relationship, whatever kind it is. So, what's the deal with that? And what was the role of that?
Okay, who wants to take either question?
I can.
Oh, he's going to a third.
No, go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
Sorry for stealing things. I have no comment on oil. So as far as the going abroad is concerned, I have not been abroad for this purpose, but am generally of the view that this is not an American story, it is a human story, and that, as the questioner mentioned, these issues are unfortunately not isolated to the United States. Issues of intolerance, of bigotry, of hatred are somewhat ubiquitous around the world, and efforts need to be made not just in the United States, but also in those countries, in those regions, to combat that.
Continuing, I would just contextualize the present moment of abroad experience is that and I know definitely Allison and Matthew as well, are very cautious and thoughtful about when we speak somewhere, where we present ourselves. I think probably more thought goes into where is this really the right place? Is this where I should be speaking or should someone else be speaking? And then there's even just mundane issues of having day jobs, that this isn't the primary thing we do most of the time. We live our lives and build our careers, and I think a lot about making sure that the places that I do appear are not stepping out of turn. So I think that comes up a lot. So I'd be open in the future, because white nationalism and white supremacy in general is something that's very international. It's the American white nationalist movement has always been deeply connected with Western and Eastern Europe, and both on the party organizational level and individual relationships. There was lots of electoral victories in Britain in the early 2000s, and shortly after that, lots of American white nationalists would travel to Russia regularly to be hosted at conferences and to present at universities, and so it's something that should be thought about, but I just want to make sure that I'm the right person to do those things. Love. So I think I suppose full disclosure is that Allison and I are now in a relationship, and I think I've always been cautious about talking about that, and I think I'll pass it to you if you're willing. Because one is, so actually this whole thing is a very personal thing to sort of be up here and talk about this panel, but to think the level of it that it all turned on personal relationships is the most vulnerable aspect of it. The fact, but I don't think there's any other way that happens. I think when we talk about one thing I like to say is that we say change your mind. Oh, she changed her mind, or he changed his mind, and that is not only much too small of a statement to describe somebody changing their mind, but it also doesn't take into account the fact that that's a human thing, that you don't just change the facts that you believe. You don't say, I believe this fact and now I have been corrected. The capital of this country is actually the capital of this country. It is, you change your worldview because you change the relationships you have with other people, and I don't think there's any other way that happens. And so that's inherently personal. It's inherently some form of love, whatever and I think there should be more words to describe those different forms you have for different people. But I don't think there's any other sort of persuasion or change that happens without changing the community that you orient yourself to and that you consider to be important to you. To the extent where I would say the idea of changing your mind and the idea of changing your community is the same thing. It's not two things that happen simultaneously, but actually the same action. And so it becomes so complicated, especially when we're talking about scaling up interventions, because we're talking about deeply felt real friendships and real relationships.
Yes.
And it's possible to create systems and programs that can make that, can induce it, but it's not possible to put money at something and create relationships.
Yeah, I want to add to that there's so many good ways to change a society for better. It does not require somebody to have a love relationship with somebody who's an adversary. However, I would be negligent to not mention that in the work I've seen in 30 years with all the people I've mentored and the people I've been involved with, in deep enemy situations, in war, in Syria and other places, love is really often the only answer. It is the only reason why people who've lost 30 members of a family and 40 members of a family, and you watch them crying and hugging each other, because they only have each other as victims. And you see this, and then everything changes afterwards in terms of how they work together. It's a solidarity that no amount of differences politically can make on that relationship. And those are the people who change history. So you asked the right question, but not romantic love is one, but there's many kinds of intense love here that are the secret in many parts of the world.
It's the secret ingredient.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess I also say two thoughts about this. I think the first one is that when I started talking to Derek, I certainly had no intention of well, a few things. I guess first of all, falling in love with him, and I guess second of all, ending up on a panel several years later. You know, I think when you're in college and you write emails or you send text messages or whatever, you never expect them to be published later on when you were 20 years old writing things, right? And so I think a lot in retrospect makes it feel clean in some way, or like it ended very nicely, and I think that we're very fortunate that it had, I think in a lot of ways, for us and for Derek, ended nicely. But I think that for me, trying to figure out why do you believe what you believe is something that inherently makes you closer to somebody, and so you have to be open to being closer to them. And I think that there's a lot of research behind this, right? That if you ask liberals to write an essay that they think would be persuasive to conservatives and vice versa, that they don't even touch on what the other person's arguments are. It's like less than 10% of the time, you know, they'll address and use a moral framework and use the arguments that actually would be compelling to the other side. And so for me to try to argue why white nationalism is wrong without first really and truly trying to understand why Derek thought it was right wouldn't have been effective. Like there's no conversations there. And so it's certainly not everybody's point of access, and so it's not something that I'm advocating as like this is what everybody should do. But for me, it was something that I was open to, I had time for, and I really liked Derek as a person. I will say that when he asked me out and still believed in white nationalism, I said no. That should be on the record. But before he had officially renounced and sort of lost his family and everything there, but after I was very sure that his ideology had changed, then I was comfortable sort of moving into a more romantic relationship, and we're still together.
Hi, my name is Becca Pugh, and I have so many questions for you, but Derek, I just wanted to ask you, when you had gone abroad and then returned and kind of became this enemy to the campus community, did you also see them as an enemy? And within that context, what kind of emotional, psychological impact did Matthew's reaching out to you to help you move have on you? And can I ask two questions? Is that allowed? It's kind of related. When you were coming to the campus, did you have it in your mind to recruit people from campus for the white nationalist movement? That's it, yeah.
Okay, good, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nick Sherwood. I'm a doctoral student, very much interested in the psychology of transformation. If we were to sit down with a white nationalist, walk us through a conversion process, understanding it's going to take years and years and years, but I would love to hear if you guys, all three of you, have other success stories and what that process might look like.
Truth in advertising, that's my star student. So.
Right, so thinking about this, I want to make sure that I'm remembering all of the questions, and so I might ask you to repeat it a little bit, but I did not see the campus community as my enemy. I don't think at any point, at least not broadly. I did bisect into subgroups. I thought the people who were the most vocal and the people who posted like sometimes like calling for violence against me, I saw them as extremely hostile, and I did not like those people. But as a whole, I think it's probably essential that I had gotten to know this community, which only had 800 students, which is a small enough college that if there's a new student, you like notice them. You know, if somebody who's not part of the campus is there, it's like a very tiny town. And so it was small enough that I had a sense of the biographies of almost everybody around me, and I had gotten to know them, and if they were hurting and felt harmed by my actions, that mattered in a way that it did not matter when people would send me hate mail when I was a teenager. And so I think the fact that I felt committed to that community in some way, whatever way it was essential. And what was the second part?
Do you want to repeat that?
Right. When I first showed up back, I felt attacked And so I thought I wanted to present what is white nationalism. There were definitely moments where I thought, oh, I'll bring some of the most scholarly white nationalists to campus and they'll give a talk and they'll show everybody how it's not so hateful, it's really rational, and we'll have a debate. And I quickly rethought it and realized I will just quietly go to class, and I never tried to convince anyone. There were, I think it would surprise people to know there were people on this campus who were receptive to white nationalism, like as there are in every context, as there are in every college campus, which is the thing I tend to try to remind people, that you can't look around and see the people who believe in white nationalism. They don't look any different from anyone else, and they exist in every social strata in America, including New College. But it was very clear to me that there was just no reason for me to do this. It was counterproductive, and I felt lucky that the school had not tried to expel me, so I didn't try to build any white nationalist groups on this campus, which it wouldn't have been for me.
Sorry, I meant before, like when you first came to the campus, did you have it in your mind to recruit?
No, I mean, for the same reasons, I didn't have it in my mind to recruit, because it was very clear that this was overall extremely hostile to white nationalism, and any action was going to be treated like an infection, a white blood cell reaction was going to happen. So it was just like pragmatism. Walking through, I think it's almost an answer for Allison or Matthew, that it is, in any context, whether it's a white nationalist or someone else, any ideology, the first question is going to have to be to yourself whether you're willing to get that close, and whether it is a good faith or a conversation. The question has to be, what do you believe? Explain it to me. What is your evidence? What is your reasoning? And you have to be able at some point to explain their worldview to them in a way that they recognize is true and accurate. And that's not necessarily something you are willing to do. It's something, I think it's part of talking about how serious this is, and how it's not always the right choice. But if you are in that position and you are trying to do that, the answer is always going to start with the individual. What is your reasoning? And are you willing to talk with me about it in an open and honest way, that we're not trying to gain points, but I'm really trying to understand it? Because otherwise it's not only never going to work, but I think it's actually sort of wrong-headed to walk around the world and say, I'm going to find something that you truly believe, and I'm going to make you not believe that anymore. It's never going to work. But I could say, tell me something you seriously believe, and I will come to understand it as you do, and then maybe I might be able to show you why it's wrong.
I mean, I think back to something Derek told me a while ago, which was that he was like similar to this, is that before explaining his whole ideology to me, he'd only ever explained it to other white nationalists or to journalists. And so neither of those are having a private, quiet conversation that's in good faith. I will say that as far as other conversations that I've had, I grew up in a very conservative, extremely white, rural place. And I think that a lot of, probably ubiquitously, those people would not describe themselves as racist, or probably have sort of ingrained reasons that they have fled Cleveland and instead moved to an exurb. And so having conversations with family members and other people as to why they believe what they believe, what is underneath that, because those people and I have vested relationships in each other. And so there's a reason that we're connecting in a way that we want to understand each other. And so I think if there's incentive to listen, then there's movement there. And I've seen movement within my family and other people I know.
And just to follow on to something that Allison had brought up earlier, which is the dual different points of contact. So, for example, I felt that coming from where I stood and how I looked and so on, that I couldn't have a conversation about white nationalism with Derek without it being not just confrontational, but really adversarial. And I didn't think that I could, not only did I not think that I could change his mind in such a conversation, but I felt that if I did that, that he would stop coming to these dinners, and I would never see him again. And so I felt like the best use of my energies was doing what I did. And Allison, by contrast, had a different opportunity set, which she obviously seized upon. And other people on the campus who spoke up very loudly to say that not only was white nationalism sort of factually wrong, but it was morally wrong. They also had a different opportunity set which they seized. So you have to, I think, be aware of where you are in relation to that individual and what you can do and what's the best way to direct your energies.
And I think there's also a risk of bias too, in using positions of privilege that you have, right? So white people are less defensive when talking to other white people about issues of race, and similarly, men are more likely to get further with other men when talking about misogyny and feminism. And so I think recognizing that there are different defensive structures that different people evoke, and trying to figure out how is it that I can be most effective, or at least like what is my guess for how I can be most effective here, and then doing that and not being silent in whatever way you have access to do.
Yeah, and I don't want to minimize either the people coming to the Sabbath table every week who didn't talk about white nationalism, because the issue of dignity and respect in the literature and our experience around the world is that gestures of respect open the heart and the mind in a way that is the opposite of the humiliation and shame that drives people into hate ideologies, often in the first place. Sometimes people are in hate ideologies because they just developed a certain way of thinking. It's not necessarily child abuse, it's not necessarily humiliation, but shame and humiliation certainly keeps people in something, because that becomes the family as opposed to everybody else. And that Sabbath table was the exact opposite. Every week for 2 years. And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I think everybody here would applaud your entire story and your effort, your continuing effort. I want to pick up though on Marc's original question when we started the discussion. It's the broader question dealing with institutional racism and the structures in society that we're still living with. I grew up in the segregated South, and my worldview changed 60 years ago. My family is still as unreconstructed now as they were then. And they are still going to vote for Mr. Trump. And they're not the only ones. 63 million others have been in that same camp. So given that, how does the individual transformation that we've heard about get broadened to bring change across the structural barriers in our society, given where we are today?
One more question.
Hi, Michael Barr. Thank you for sharing your experiences and informed insights based on that. I'm curious about, this is more for Derek. I know that white nationalism intersects with the Christian community, and I was wondering, were you raised with that faith or any faith, or what resources did you find in faith, or did you find a faith community, or how did that strengthen convictions, or either way?
That one's relatively quick to answer, that the intersection between Christianity and white nationalism is extremely complicated, and I think the dominant religious affiliation of people within the white nationalist movement is the one that my family chose, which is staunch atheism. The role that Christianity plays is usually not mainstream traditional Christianity. I think it's almost quite telling. It was a religion forum on its own front, and it had tons of subfields, and one of the last ones was a forum called Traditional Christianity. And all the other ones were forms of Christianity that believed that white people are the actual tribes of Israel, and the Jewish people are satanic pretenders, and religions that believe that the universe is a machine that created white people as the ideal, and these complicated sort of theologies that people invoke in order to justify their worldview around race. And I think there have been dissertations written on it, and it's complicated, but I think atheism is the dominant stream. That's what my family, both of my parents were raised in traditional Protestant Christian homes, and both of them condemned it and said God is dead and we're atheists, and that's how I was raised.
I want to address this question here just briefly. You're asking exactly the right question about the whole society and how difficult it is to see such a labor-intensive process in just a small set of relationships. I think that we human beings are really capable of retooling when we see a major problem. And it is only now we're starting to realize that one of the major threats to the future of life on Earth, because we can't even get to climate because of this extremely divisive infection within democratic systems and the use of people's hatreds to destroy the society. That having been said, I think we can get much more creative about stimulating millions of people not to attend conferences for $1 million, but to simply start a friendship with somebody whose ideology they may abhor, but who they want to love and care for as a person. And we have not tried that yet. Swear to God, I've been doing this for 30 years, we all just keep going back to our own groups, and we go to some other place and we recreate it, especially urbanites. And a lot of this is in rural areas and we don't go there. So part of what we're working on is the idea of how do you stimulate millions of people to adopt a new way of social change, which is relationships and care with people with whom you disagree. If you think this is impossible, and we can't, for example, Ethiopia just got 23 million people to volunteer to plant 100 trees each, and they did it. 350 million trees in 12 hours.
Oh.
We can stimulate millions of people if we have leadership. And I'm talking about the presidency now. I'm talking about our mindset as opinion makers, and everybody in this room is pretty educated. We start promoting the idea of building friendships across lines. There are ways that we're thinking about, but we need more ideas.
And I tend to think in the same vein as your question, that if what we are doing is meeting to talk about this ideology that is a very small number of people in the broad stream of the world, then I wonder, I think there are places for that, but it doesn't answer the broad, real questions that are future. I think it is not a understatement to say white supremacy threatens humanity. You know, in the very broadest sense of what does the future of life on Earth look like, it is essential that we tackle race, racial division, the way resources are divided among the peoples of the Earth. Like, this is the actual question that we're dealing with, even though it sounds so grandiose. And so I really try to invest myself in thinking broad ideology of anti-racism, which I have been deeply influenced by a professor here who I mentioned in the Anti-Racism Center earlier, from Kendi, who we were here a few months ago talking about this, that anti-racism is an ideology that tries to flatten the hierarchies. And I think it's far too much to say if you use the right words, you change things, but it's essential that we do think about it that way, that we think about the gravity of it. And I really don't believe that there's anyone who can't be influenced by being called to think. If we have massive inequalities based on race, there's only two answers. It's either that we have policies that have created racial inequality, or that some races are just not as good as others. And we know that's not accurate. We know that it's policy that creates this. And if we are faced with it that starkly, we have to answer, like, what are we going to do about it and what are the consequences of it? And I think that's something that I would ask any person who is trying to get into political office. It's what I would ask people who are working for nonprofits to think about the stark reality of racial inequality and how broad the issue is, and that the only point of talking about white nationalism is trying to say, look at this ideology that has this very extreme, explicit belief about race and justifying racial inequality, and try to expand that out and say, how can I then understand the more moderate beliefs that lots of people have? I think that's really a good starting point. That's one of the reasons I show up to events like this, because I think if we can talk about that ideology, we can pan out and say, what are the beliefs that really need to change in order to get somewhere else? And so I invest in defining racism, defining races as an idea that there are some groups that are inherently better than other groups, and trying to dismantle that worldview among the billions of people who really engage in it and hold it. And I know that sounds huge, but it really is a space where we all have something to do, and I think there's a lot of productivity there, and not doing it is capitalism.
Two more questions. And then you sure I'll have the last word.
Hi, I want to thank you so much for coming. I'm a conflict resolution student at George Mason. Your story is so inspiring. I wrote a term paper last semester on Former White Supremacy, using you all as an example. My main question, although I have so many, is for Matthew. Did you receive any pushback from the Jewish community in your actions, and how you wanted to form a relationship with Derek, and how did you handle that? Thank you.
Sure. There was not much in the way of certainly an observant Jewish community on the campus. There was there were Jews on the campus, and I think I caught flack from many people on the campus. For example, when I invited Derek to come to join me for that first dinner, most of the people who had been coming to those dinners over the past year stopped coming. They didn't want anything to do with it. And I told them that, and they told me that if I invited him, basically it was up to them or him. And I told them it's up to you. The door is always open. You're certainly welcome to come whenever you want, but this is the thing that I think is right, and so I'm going to do it. So I wasn't especially concerned with any pushback from any group, whether it was Jewish or Gentile. I think that it's very dangerous to start behaving in ways because you think that that's the way that everyone is going to like you.
So I was wondering about what you think the proper balance is between the process that you're talking about, and then also creating a welcoming and accepting space for people of color and people who are hurt and harmed by this ideology. Like, for example, students in like the Harvard scandal, where students were posting hateful rhetoric online, and then their admission was rescinded. So like, what's the balance between protecting the students who went through that action, but also the students at the school who like were harmed by their rhetoric?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, I'll just start answering it in that I think there's a danger whenever this is the story that we're talking about, because there's a real interest in saying reaching out to a racist is going to therefore change their mind, and then that will make the world better. And there's clearly obviously truth to that. But thinking about what we said, or what Allison said earlier about we have places we can put our resources, I think that this should never get lost in the priority. The first priority always has to be people's safety, people's inclusion, people's security. And the instinct to try to reach out to a person who is standing up and giving Nazi slogans, I think it is incorrect to say, oh, I'm going to prioritize that person. I think the priority has to be all the people who are not in the room, who are not welcome, who don't feel safe, who don't feel included there, and making a space that includes them. And in the outreach where you're trying to talk to somebody about their worldview that excludes so many people has to include that in the mission, that the point is to make it safer. The point is to make it a space that welcomes all the people who have been excluded for so long, and that if you find yourself saying, well, that's not what's important to me, that's why I need to reach out to the most extreme hate monger in the room, then I think that's probably usually the wrong instinct. And it always has to be part of a broader program to think about broad inclusion. And I say that here in this space because I think that actually a real way that you can walk away from this room and say, I heard about, they reached out to a white supremacist who went to dinner and now he's talking about anti-racism and that's the lesson, but I think it's so much more complicated and dangerous. That's the full lesson.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that we all spend a lot of time thinking and talking about how there's this real debate between civil resistance and then sort of civil discourse, and that the way that we often have our story talked about is that it's just this civil discourse, which I do think is incredibly important, right? Reaching out and talking to other people. But I think that if, for example, campus would have responded by being very open to Derek or by having him express his ideology freely by saying, oh, well, all ideas are equal here, that would have been extremely detrimental to people of color on campus and Jewish students whose education was being impacted by the fact that he was here. And so in this case, I think that the ostracism that Derek faced in order to prioritize people of color on campus and say that it's a safe space for you was not the wrong instinct. And I think that then having more private conversations somewhere else and having Shabbat dinners in a quiet place to people who wanted to come and felt safe coming, and that was separate, was sort of a very important balance to have.
So you're suggesting a very complicated both and strategy and ethic.
And I would connect it even more and say that I do not believe that I would have engaged in Shabbat dinners and hearing out why my ideology was so wrong had I not first had a community that I respected that was saying I didn't belong. And my question when Allison first talked was, why did they feel that way? It wasn't just an abstract, like, change my mind. And so I think it's more than, it's both. It's like, I think they are essential. You cannot have discourse without strong condemnation and assertion of values.
Let's
share our thanks again for